I brought your questions and outline, and other questions that I dropped in. I dropped off for like 15 minutes. I got one guy moving out. Street unexpected. I do. I forced this one.
Oh, okay. Around the corner here. Cruise around the corner. Follow the wall up on the right.
Okay. That's about the only transition. So yeah, I'm turning my one. It's another room. So the painters just fixing stuff. Yeah.
It's usually the result of the urgent.
So.
All right. So I'm going to let you run that.
Okay. Here's what I can do. How often it be rented. You know, it's like how it's gonna be. Much easier. You got it. Yeah. Deal with everything. Deal with everything.
All right.
You, I'll learn from
Purchases and leases. Restructure
We are going to. We're going to get ourselves started. I know we're starting a little late, but that is no worries. I'm sure everybody enjoyed talking to each other. I'm Erica Osborne, one of the members of the THiNK real estate team. There's Claudio. Melanie, I don't know if she's in the room. I'm over here. There she is. Melanie and Taylor. Taylor as well. We're the THiNK real estate team. We do this specific event the first Monday of every month, trying to touch on a different topic that investors that will be useful to you guys. We do have ways you can find us. You guys can read them, so I won't read them. And if you sign up on our little sign-in sheet, you'll get reminders of our stuff and how to find us and all that good stuff. So anyway, no further ado, the man that you guys came here to listen to, this is John Napier with Hanger Law, and he is all the way back to us. He's still on his final day of vacation, so he is here with us. So he's going to get started. We're going to touch on LLCs, partnerships, some creative deal structures. He's an attorney. He knows what he's doing. I'm going to let him take it from here, and then Q&A at the end. So I told you guys to come with their questions, so hopefully you did. John.
Awesome. Thanks, Erica. Thank you. No. Thank you guys for having me. I appreciate it. I'm John Napier. I'm with Hanger Law. I'm an attorney. I did just walk off a plane about an hour and a half ago, so I'm pretty casual. I hope that's all right. This is not usually how you expect attorneys to look, but I don't really care. Yeah, I've got some notes from Erica and Melanie about some things they wanted me to come and talk to you guys a bit about. I love interactive discussions. I get tired of the sound of my own voice, frankly. So if you guys have questions as we roll through this, there are a couple things that I want to make sure that I hit and talk about, but there are a couple other things as well that I want you guys to bring up. So don't feel like you have to wait for Q&A at the end unless it's completely off topic, and I just ask, I'll make sure that there's space for you guys to ask questions if it's something I haven't hit on. I'll give you a little bit of background about myself. I've been an attorney for almost 10 years. I've been in real estate since 2002. I started my career after undergrad working for a developer, a very large privately held developer. And I worked for them for 4 years as low man on the totem pole with them, and just got exposed to a lot of different elements. It was like a kindergartner trying to get a PhD for me with them. So we got exposed to a lot of different deals, saw a lot of development. Went to law school, second half of law school, they don't let you work the first year of law school. So after that, I worked for a developer, commercial developer out in Los Angeles when I was going to law school, and then came back here after that, after spending some time abroad. And then the last 10 years I've been in-house counsel for a builder and developer. I've worked at multiple law firms, was a contract CEO of a small company as well. So I've seen a lot of things, but I have not seen everything. It's very possible you guys will ask me questions that I don't know answers to. So hopefully you will deal with attorneys that actually are humble enough to say, I don't know, but I'll find out. Hopefully that's not too common of an answer that I give you guys tonight, but it is something that's very possible. So that being said, that's just a little bit of background on me. Hanger Law's been around for the last 5 years. I've been with them for 3.5. We do everything real estate, business related. We have a wills and estates practice. We have a couple litigators in-house. So we have a somewhat broad practice. We can usually help you guys with anything that you're dealing with. And frankly, if it's something that we can't help you with, I can always help you find the right person to help you on that too. So, let me ask, who here is familiar, just by raise of hands, who's familiar with like LLC structures? I mean, who's looked into that? Who has a concept of that? Okay, all right, fair amount of you. And let me take another slight poll here. When you guys think of the word partnership, what do you think of? Can someone just give me an example of what you think of when you hear the word partnership?
Marriage?
What's that?
Marriage?
Oh, that's good, all right. That's fair. How about in the real estate context, what do you guys think of when it comes to partnership? That's actually a good answer. Yes?
When two people get together to do a deal.
Okay, two people coming together to do a deal. Okay, that's a good answer. Anyone else?
They have like the money, another person may have the deal, and they get together and link up.
Yep, that's good. Anyone else? Yeah, in the back. JV. What is JV? Joint venture?
Yes,
Is that what you're saying?
exactly.
Okay, all right. I don't want to presume anyone else knows what a JV is, so thanks. Okay. And well, let me ask you, what do you think of when you say joint venture JV? What does that conjure to mind? What do you think about?
I just conjure working with somebody, like maybe somebody brings the money and somebody brings the deal. I don't know.
Okay. No, that's good. That's a good example. So I want to make sure that there's a distinction too, because in real estate there are a lot of terms that are used interchangeably. Partnerships, JVs, there are a lot of different names for a lot of different things, and we think of these things in conceptual terms, but you also have to think of things in legal terms. Did you have a?
I think of Bill Knoll, because he spoke at Trig last month. He
Yep.
talked about partnering with a corporation or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's for tax purposes.
Yeah. A guy named Bill Knoll came and spoke at the Tidewater Real Estate Investment Group. I think it was last month or the month before, and just talking about different entity structures coming together and using that for different tax purposes. So, but I want to make a distinction because we think of these things conceptually. We think of two people getting together to do a deal, or two entities, or two companies, or whatever, and that in a broad sense is a partnership. But there are very legal specific terms as well. They're legally defined terms in Virginia as to what a partnership is, what an LLC is, what a legal entity is. So, and an LLC is a limited liability company. You guys probably know that. If you have exposure to real estate investment, I'm going to get really basic for a few moments, just because again, I don't want to presume everyone in here has total exposure and an idea, but the idea for the limited liability company is the company itself, whatever it's operating and doing, it limits its liability for the assets that it has in whatever business that is functioning. So let's use a basic example of you have a rental property, right? Say it's a duplex. And you own it in an LLC, and the LLC is properly formed and it's properly operated, and we'll get into that some too. But when you have that property owned by the LLC is a separate legal entity from you as an individual, right? That's the whole point. And if something were to happen legally, like if a tenant were to slip and fall and want to sue the owner, they're going to sue the LLC because the LLC is the owner, right? And so they get into it, and again, presuming things go according to plan, even in the worst case scenario of litigation, the LLC is properly operated and formed, that person, if they were to win a lawsuit, can only go after whatever assets the LLC owns. That's a limitation of liability. So if you own it personally, right, and the tenant were to sue you, you own it in your personal name, and they get a judgment against you personally, any asset that you own personally is going to get that judgment's going to attach And they can work on collections for anything that you own personally. Any other home or property you own personally, any wages that you get, any car that you own, they can go after those assets, right? So that's why the LLC is important, yes?
What if you had umbrella insurance? So if they came against you, you had insurance to cover.
Well, that really depends on the insurance policy, but the insurance policy, even if it pays out, you're gonna have limitations on that, you're gonna have deductibles on that, and you still, my question is, why would you even take that risk? I mean, an umbrella policy is not a bad idea, but why am I gonna put all my personal assets at risk in that scenario, right? If I can properly protect them. So the idea, the LLC, it's in the name, right? You're limiting your liability inside of that company, it's a separate legal entity. So you get into larger deals, I mean, when you start getting into apartment deals, when you start getting into development deals, when you start getting into whatever you guys are into, if you're into self-storage, right? If you're into mobile home parks, if you're into whatever it is, it's important to make sure that you're thinking about how do I contain the liability that I'm exposing myself to, because the bigger the asset, the bigger the deal, the bigger the development, the bigger your potential liability is. So partnerships in Virginia are, again, a separately defined legal entity. If you have a general partnership is when two people, I think you guys just talking about, is when two individuals or even two companies just come together and do a deal without anything formalized. That's called a general partnership in Virginia. There's no limitation of liability in general partnership. And the important thing to remember is, if you just say, hey, Melanie and I are gonna do a deal, like, okay, we don't put anything in writing, we're just like, we talk about it, whatever, we're like, hey, let's go flip this house, okay? All right, you know what, I'll put up this money, you put up that money, we'll hire your contractor, we'll use my title company, we work it out, we start doing the deal, right? We essentially have a general partnership. That's the default between us, because we haven't established any other legal entity. And in a general partnership, we are jointly and severally liable, which is a very big term that means we're both equally responsible for each other's actions. So if I screw up really badly and mess up a job, Melanie is just as liable as I am in a general partnership. We can both bind the general partnership legally. We can sign and say, you know what, Melanie could go out and say, you know what, let's put debt on this property. I'm gonna borrow $150,000 against this $200,000 flip. And if we don't have things set, if things aren't well defined, I'm just as liable as she is essentially in that scenario. So general partnerships are just kind of a default, but you gotta be very careful there. Again, when you're talking partnerships, you have this broad concept of two people coming together to do a deal, but you have a very specific legal structure too. In Virginia, there's also things called limited partnerships, right? Or limited liability partnerships, registered limited liability partnerships. Again, oftentimes that's when you could have someone with bigger money coming in and they're just putting in the money, and then you got someone to run the job, right? You can do that under an LLC structure. I'm not gonna get too much in the weeds at this very moment about that, but just to kind of give you this broad overview of the different legal structures that you have. A limited partnership is where you have a general partner who has, again, general partner or partners have the liability, but they have the control. The limited partner puts in the money and they have certain distribution rights to profits, but they don't have any control essentially over the project. But the limited partner's liability is kind of quarantined, if you will. They have the protection in that sense. You still have the general partner who's running the job and still responsible and liable. So I want to make sure that there's a broad sense of, you can talk joint ventures, right? A joint venture is not, it's essentially an agreement between two parties to do a deal together. But you could have two companies that come together under a JV agreement, a joint venture agreement, and a lot of times I've drafted those documents, I've seen those documents drafted, it says this does not create a partnership, right? Very explicitly and specifically. It's just like, hey, we're coming together to do this deal. And this deal only, and I'm putting in this labor and money, and the other person is putting in this labor and money, and we are coming together to do this specific deal. We're doing a joint venture, but this doesn't create some other separate legal entity, or this doesn't necessarily create some other partnership under which we're both liable for each other's actions. So, as much as it's frustrating potentially, I think it's important to understand how legal structures work versus the broad concepts that we talk about in real estate. Like if someone says land contract, or someone says subject to contract, you know, or someone says, you know, due on sale clause, or the transferability clause in a deed of trust. I mean, there are a lot of these terms that end up coming in, and people can either get confused by it or try to use interchangeably that, again, may or may not apply, but you gotta make sure you understand very specifically. As an attorney, everything is language, right? That's what the law is, right? It is language, it's words, and everything turns on the language that you use. So when you're looking to go in and do these deals, you wanna think very specifically about that. You can talk in broad concepts with people that you wanna partner with, but then you say, okay, now let's get into the actual detail, the nitty-gritty. What is it that we wanna do? What do we wanna accomplish? How do we wanna accomplish it? And those are the basic building blocks of how you go into any major real estate deal. You know, are we gonna go get huge institutional money? I was on one deal. It was a large apartment development deal where I was representing a seller, but one of the partners in the sellers ended up jumping over and investing with the purchaser as well. So I ended up not exactly on both sides, but kind of on both sides. And it was, you know, they had a huge institutional investor come in as a limited partner, and then they had a general, you know, then they had an LLC that was the general partner. And the structure was immensely complicated because it was one of the biggest banks in the country coming in to invest in this apartment deal. But it showed this, say, what are we trying to do? Like, they were structuring something very different and unique, typically for this area, in a way that, you know, frankly, it's important to understand what terms that you're using and how you want to go into it. They had a specific goal, said we're going to develop it this way, we're going to get this money, there are going to be these payouts, and then this is how we end up structuring all of that and putting all that together. So I feel like I might be losing some of you guys in the weeds. I'm talking about some specifics. I do want to pause for a second. Is anybody confused at this point? Is anyone? What's that? Okay. What are you confused about?
There's just a lot of different terms.
Yeah, that's fair. I think that I'm not trying to confuse anybody. I'm bringing this up in the specificity and the detail that I am, just because when you get into real estate investment, you've got to be very careful. The law turns on language. The words that you use are important. And when you say, I'm gonna get into a JV, or we're gonna do a limited partnership, or we're gonna do this through an LLC, you know, or we're gonna partner on this deal, you know, you're talking, there's concept, and then there's the feet of it, right? They're the legal realities of what you're doing and how you're doing it. So, just kind of bringing all that up just to say, yeah, did you have a question?
Yes, so if you are into a partnership, can you name it LLC, or it should be LLC?
That's actually a good question, because that's exactly my point. What are you doing?
Well, if you're gonna form a partnership, say general or limited, because I mean, it doesn't matter, because somebody's a general, you know, anyway.
Right.
But if you name it LLC, then it's a limited.
You don't have an LLC unless you form an LLC with a state.
Okay.
It's not an LLC unless it's an actual legal entity. A general partnership is not something you have to file with the state of Virginia. General partnership is just a default. A registered limited partnership, limited liability partnership, is something you register with a state. An LLC is a legal entity, like a corporation, that you file, like you form that with this, like I'll talk about Virginia because I'm barred in Virginia. A lot of this is applicable to other states in many respects, but I can't necessarily talk about states that I'm not barred in. But the point is, in Virginia, for you to have an LLC, you have to form an LLC with the state of Virginia, the State Corporation Commission. That's the only way you have a legal entity. So, does that answer your question? So if you want to call anything an LLC, you better form the LLC with a state.
Okay.
Right? You can call an LLC, but it's not an LLC. It doesn't limit any of your liability if you don't have an actual legal entity formed.
So if I have LLC and then I say, okay, I'm gonna form a company, and then, you know, we can partner for this company, can I do that?
Sure, yeah, yes, you can. So, let me talk a little bit about that then.
question, sorry?
So he's asking if you want to form an LLC, can you partner inside of an LLC? So let me back up and just talk about an LLC for a second. Limited liability company, you form it with the state of Virginia. It's a registered legal entity. It limits your liability. The only thing that's on the public records are the principal office address of the company, and then who the registered agent is, and what the registered agent's office address is, and then the name of the company. Those are the only things that are actual public record, right? Yeah.
So what about there's another person that formation, what is it called? There's a second person that is responsible for the initiation of the LLC. Is that public as well?
Registered agent.
No, not registered agent, because registered agent is a go forward.
You mean the organizer?
Yes, there you
The
go.
organizer?
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so on the articles of organization,
Uh-huh.
you will see who the organizer was.
Okay, so that also is public.
That is public. That's on so the articles of organization are now public record. I mean, that is something that, but the only thing that says is, again, the name of the entity, the office address, the registered agent, their address, but often there you will see a name of the organizer on there. So if you sign a physical document or if you form an LLC online with the state of Virginia, it will say who the organizer is. Typically that's me, you know, or if I'm doing that for clients, they'll just see John M. Napier, you know, as the organizer. Doesn't necessarily give a whole lot of info, but it could if you form your own entity, your name could show up in that way. So, but that being said, you form the LLC, you have a legal entity, but you don't have any of you just have a bit of a skeleton. You don't have any of the meat and bones, or the meat on the bones there. So really with an LLC, an operating agreement is what dictates how companies run. An LLC is run. An operating agreement is what dictates how an LLC is run, okay? So you have an operating agreement, and then that's gonna define who owns what percentage, right? It's gonna talk about how the company is run, who has control over what actions. I mean, it can go, I've done, 3-page operating agreements, and I've done 60-page operating agreements. And it really depends on the complexity and what you're trying to do. People who have businesses flipping homes, you can get a lot of information packed into, 5, 6, 7 pages to cover the bases. You know what I mean? There's been large developments, subdivisions, mixed-use developments, and it's, 40, 50-page operating agreements that I've done for people, and it kind of runs the gamut. So you can talk a lot of specificity. I mean, I've seen, I think someone referenced Bill Knoll earlier. He was talking about a 120-page operating agreement, which is, I don't even know why you need 120 pages. I mean, frankly, I'd be curious to.
Big font size.
Big font, yeah, maybe so, maybe so. I think yeah. That's a little overkill to me. I certainly don't want to have to read a 120-page operating agreement on a flip, so, yeah.
What I've seen is that usually if somebody's gonna go into a partnership and they already have an LLC, they'll just form another LLC, right?
Yep.
And it'll be them and the partner that they're working with for that specific one.
Yep.
Do the deal, maybe keep it open if they're gonna do multiple deals after that, or they'll shut it down after that one deal is done.
Mm-hmm.
What's the benefit of doing that versus keeping your LLC separate and creating a partnership to merge those two LLCs for that specific deal, or is that completely off?
No, that's a good question. So the question is, again, you've got to think in terms of liability.
Mm-hmm.
So so let me talk about like a developer client. Most developer clients I have, they're forming an LLC for every single development they're doing because they're quarantining their liability on every single job. So it depends, and you're gonna get sick of me here, and you're gonna get sick of hearing me say that because every question to a lawyer always is, it depends. I gotta be honest with you guys. It depends. It depends because what kind of job are you doing? Like, what are you doing with that LLC? What is the joint venture coming together to do? Is it something where it's gonna be a buy and hold asset? Is it something where you're gonna build it and flip it, or you're gonna rehab it and flip it, and you're gonna wanna keep doing that over and over? That's gonna be the question, what's the purpose of what you're doing?
Okay.
So, usually, give me an example of what you're talking about, like a type of deal, just any type of deal.
So a regular flip, right?
Like a regular flip.
Mhm.
So you have someone who's got an LLC already, another person's got an LLC already, and they wanna come together and they wanna do a flip, right? Are they just gonna do one flip? I mean, is that what they're envisioning? Say, hey, this is a $1 million home, we're getting it for 300 grand, we can rehab it for 300 and
We're
make 400 grand.
gonna do this one and see how well we work together.
Okay, so in that kind of scenario, I would say you want a new LLC, and those individual LLCs, so each person here has an LLC, you probably want a new LLC, and your existing LLCs can be the members, right? And in language of the LLC, the members are the owners, right? In Virginia, when you have an LLC, the members are the owners. So they can each own 50% in their LLCs. And in that scenario, I would suggest most likely that they should do a manager managed LLC. And so in Virginia, again, you have member managed LLCs and manager managed LLCs, okay? When you have, especially when you have entities that are owners, right? Especially when you have entities that are owners, you gotta have an individual, it's important to have individuals who actually can sign and have control over the company. And so, in that scenario, I'd say, let's say you and I each have an LLC, we're gonna flip something. Our LLCs can be 50-50 owners, and then you and I individually can be the managers of the LLC. And that way, you and I can figure out who can sign for what, and if we need to put parameters, on how much we can sign for without the other person's permission. There are just many factors in here. So if you and I have complete, total autonomy and ability to sign whenever we want, however we want for the LLC, I could say, you know what, we should go out and get some hard money for this. And I just unilaterally decide that, and then I obligate our LLC to 50 grand in hard money that we may or may not have needed, But if we put in the operating agreement, said neither one of us can obligate the company to anything more than $2,000 at any one time, without the other, the other manager's consent. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Those are the type of things you're gonna need to think through when you're getting into a deal. Let's say that we do a flip and it goes great, right? And we wanna keep doing it. We can keep that LLC in place with each of our LLCs as 50-50 owners, right? And we can just keep doing business underneath that LLC. If you and I were to go out and buy an office building, and we're like, that's awesome, that's great, let's go find another office building. I would actually form another LLC to buy the next office building. I wouldn't buy multiple office buildings under the same LLC, because you wanna quarantine that liability, right, in the deal. So, it depends. In a flip, you're holding an asset, but then you're flipping it out, you're not holding it, you're letting it go. You're not holding on to a lot of assets, you're rolling stuff over.
When you were talking about partnerships, all I envisioned was like the operating agreement for
Yep.
two separate entities, right? So it's
Yep.
like, this is how the relationship's gonna be for this partnership.
Yep.
Is that too much of a oversimplification, or is it?
No, you just wanna make sure, again, you're talking on a broad concept level.
Okay.
It's a partnership, right? And that's right? That's not a bad idea. You just have to be careful to understand and to define your terms correctly. So you're not actually, it's not a partnership as a legal entity in Virginia. It's a broad partnership, and the two people are coming together to do a deal.
Okay.
Hey, let's partner together, let's JV, let's get together and do a flip, and we'll form a new LLC that we both own 50-50. So
When you go into a partnership in the legalese term of Virginia law,
Yep.
are those two entities married forever and ever, and now you have to go through a process to absolve the partnership, or it depends?
Well, yeah, no. It depends. I think there are people, I actually think there are people in this room who understand very well what has to happen sometimes to decouple partnerships and entities.
Murder.
What's that?
Murder.
Murder?
No, I think most people are utilizing the LLC, the LLCs to go ahead and go do these deals. But I wanna just get to the meat and potatoes of the partnership in its most basic form,
Sure.
which we already established general partnership. We're gonna do a deal, we'll just partner up. But
Right.
outside of that, like, what are some of the, what's the worst case scenario in a bad partnership?
Okay, that's a good question. The worst case scenario is we partner to do a deal. Let's just say you and I are gonna buy this office building.
Mhm.
We don't put any legal entity and structure, any other structure together. That's just by default a general partnership in Virginia. We're jointly and severally liable for all of our actions in this. Let's say that I hit someone in the parking lot out here and they sue us, right? So we bought this building, they sue us, and they get a $3 million judgment. You have a $3 million judgment against you, not just me, right? Because we own the building.
Mhm.
I hit him, my fault, but you and I are jointly and severally liable. That means we're both equally liable to the fullest extent in that scenario.
Okay.
That's why I just don't advise that.
No partnership.
No, not general partnership.
Okay.
Right? I don't advise a general partnership in that scenario. That's why you have to be intentional. You have to be very intentional when you're going in to do deals, to think through them and to think through the scenarios of how you always want to think about the best case, and then you hire me and the attorney to think of the worst case, right? Everyone is always optimistic about whatever deal they're doing, but then unfortunately I have to live my life in the space of thinking, well, what happens if this all goes wrong, right? And there's a balance there too, because I know attorneys who, they're deal killers. I mean, they can think of every possible worst case scenario and will shoot every hole in every deal and do everything they can to say, listen, this is gonna go wrong six ways from Sunday, right? And just really discourage you. And there's a balance there to say, well, you know, I wanna help you accomplish your goal. I wanna help you get this deal done, but we have to think through these other elements, right? We have to think through all of these different scenarios. Some scenarios that are common, and then there are uncommon scenarios that you just do your best to factor into. You're not gonna be able to think of every scenario. It's impossible. Yeah,
So, for most law firms, do they have kind of boilerplate contracts that they can use, or is it completely, brand new each time?
What kind of contract are you
Or
talking
in
about?
terms of operating agreements and stuff like that?
Most,
Like what you were talking about.
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah.
I'm gonna do, like, people buy apartment buildings and office buildings in partnership all the time. Do you guys have one that you use and can?
yeah, I'm not drawing stuff up from scratch every time.
Right.
You know, I'm not drawing things from scratch every time. I'm usually jumping off of an existing structure that I have, depending on the scenario and the case and the deal, and then what the client is trying to accomplish and how they're trying to accomplish it. So it's not as simple as I just pull this off the shelf and just, it's not a rain contract, you just like, hey, put in the name, check these boxes, you know? But I'm not having to write indemnity clauses every time, I'm not having to write severability clauses every time, I'm not having to write, arbitration clauses I mean, there are templated versions that I just take and will then go and adapt for the specific scenarios. I can't speak to the firms. I mean, I know there are like some of the very large firms with some very, very good older real estate attorneys who've been around a long time. They've got forms that they use. So that's kind of a case by case, honestly. But yeah, I'm not sitting there just creating brand new things every time. I'm taking a lot of forms and structures that I have and adapting them. I think there's a question over there. Yes, ma'am.
So if you are two people, two different LLCs, and you go into a joint venture together and not form that LLC umbrella,
Yep. So the default is a general partnership.
so
If-
joint
so-
ventures defaults to general partnership.
If you're just going in to say, hey, we're gonna do business together, and you don't form any other entity or don't formalize an agreement, you can have a joint venture agreement that says, hey, we're going to do this, and this is how the deal's gonna go, and this is the profit splits, and these are the responsibilities. A joint venture agreement, but again, that doesn't create a separate legal entity, right? That creates an understanding of how the deal's gonna play out, right? But I had some clients who were gonna do a subdivision, and so they wanted to put together a development agreement. So I put together a development agreement and just outlined the whole deal, everybody signed it, and then eventually I formed a brand new LLC for that development, right? So there are multiple stages and steps potentially depending on what you're trying to do. But sometimes people just wanna get an agreement, so they say, hey, we are agreeing to this, we are contractually obligated to this agreement, we understand this is what your role is, this is what my role is, this is how we're gonna get paid, this is what happens if you don't do what you say you're gonna do, et cetera. And then, but I'm not gonna leave them in a place where they're just working off the development agreement. They have to have a separate legal entity to buy the land, and then to develop it, and then to work through their lines with the bank, and to get their bonding, and so many other things. So, yeah.
What's the difference between a joint venture agreement, an operating agreement, and a development agreement?
That's a good question. Joint venture agreement and development agreement can kind of be similar. I mean, a development agreement is, we're gonna develop this project and this is how it's gonna go. Joint venture is a little bit broader. Doesn't have to be, it could be you could do any business under a joint venture agreement in a lot of respects. We're gonna come together and put in this cash to go operate a solar wind farm or whatever, and then this is how we're gonna do it. An operating agreement is very specific. An operating agreement is the document under Virginia law that dictates how an LLC is operated. So you have corporations and you have LLCs typically. Those are the two main legal structures in Virginia. Partnerships are pretty rare, to be honest with you, on the legal side of things. But corporations are dictated by the articles of incorporation and their bylaws. That's what dictates how a corporation is run. For an LLC, you have the articles of organization. Those usually don't say much of anything other than, hey, we're forming this entity, this LLC in Virginia, and here's the registered agent and their address, and here's the principal office address, and we're gonna, we're forming, typically, the template version is we're forming this entity to use it for any legal business purpose in Virginia. And then the operating agreement, which is not a public record document, like the articles are, the operating agreement is gonna say, okay, here are who the owners, here's how much they own, here's how the company's run, who's the tax matters partner, right? What happens if we have a buyout? What happens if there's a deadlock with decision making? The operating agreement is what dictates how the LLC is run, okay? JVs and development agreements, those are general contractual understandings of how a project is gonna go. Does that make sense? Okay.
So, I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, we have a couple hands. Go ahead, Carlos, real quick.
So, for people that are, doing an operating agreement,
Yes.
they're forming an LLC and they're getting ready to write up an operating agreement, but it's two individuals that are coming in together to form that LLC.
Uh-huh.
What are some questions that they can think about so that it's not just a general operating agreement, it has some substance and it doesn't create friction later down the road as they're growing the business? Just some top questions that they can think about.
That's a good question. So, and I think this was actually, I think Melanie sent me this question, which is good. I'm gonna use that as a jumping off point. Let me talk about just going into business with people in general, right? It's immensely important that you have a good sense. Like, it's my job essentially to come in and help you form the entity and to get in a place to accomplish the goal you're looking at. I can't always go out there and vet your partners, right? Unless I know something about them that I can tell you about them. But oftentimes, I don't necessarily, I might know one of the parties, I might know both the parties, but it's not really my position necessarily to go in and say, well, this person is like X, Y, Z, or that person. You need to go in really considering, to the best of your ability, and understanding who you're going into business with, right? So that's just important to know. You're gonna need to go in and figure out who's gonna own what, who's gonna put in what money, who's gonna control the business, who's gonna sign the documents, what are the roles and responsibilities. I mean, those are the main things that you gotta think about. And then on a broader sense, you gotta really think about, do I know this person or this company? Do I trust this person or this company?
Kind of like a prenup before marriage. Like, if you're going into a partnership, you banter out the partnership, you're like, get your own lawyers, right, to represent you to form potentially that OM, that's the prenup. And then once you've settled on how your partnership's gonna run, then you can go get married, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I always, there are often times where I will form an operating agreement for multiple parties, and, I'm just saying, I'm like, listen, make sure you read it, make sure you understand it, make sure you have any questions. people always have the opportunity to get their own attorneys, right? Their own personal attorneys. So in that deal, I was talking about that apartment deal where I was representing a seller for some land that is being developed into apartments, right? So I was legal counsel for the seller, but then one of those sellers was going into the partnership on the buying side. So I was his personal attorney to kind of vet out the buying side of things, right? Right, and the other partner on the buyer had their own attorney, and that was the attorney for the buying entity. Does that make sense? You tracking with me there?
Yeah.
So everyone, I never discourage someone from having their own counsel. You know, it can always. You always have to be careful too, because what I was saying earlier, some lawyers are just deal killers. They will just find every single possible, reason not to do something and to poke holes in something. So it's always a balance. You want to be protected legally, but you also, lawyers often make money because they bill by the hour, and that's they can find ways to get hours. I believe you. Yes, sir.
When, let's say you're doing a syndication deal for an apartment complex, is it beneficial to form the LLC in the state the property is located in? Or does it,
Yeah, I mean, I can talk Virginia. I can talk about Virginia on that. I generally think that it's important to form the LLC wherever the property is, as a general. I mean, there are people out there, and it's not really a debate that I have any interest in getting into at the moment, but some people are like, well, you need a Delaware entity, or you need a Wyoming entity, or you need all these Nevada entities and things like that, and I just don't, I mean, Virginia's got pretty good, robust laws when it comes to that. I mean, if you talk about the multinational corporations in the United States, they're all formed in Delaware. Why? Because Delaware actually has the most developed law for corporations to make sure that corporations are protected in their privacy, essentially. But I mean, unless you're doing some, like, if you're talking about $50 million, $100 million syndication deal, there might be some other structures you can look at. But even if you're talking about a couple $1 million deal, on a syndication, I mean, I was just, again, I had a client who was looking to invest in a syndication deal. I got the PPM, I got all the documents, I went through them with him, just so that he understood them, and it was ultimately an LLC that's formed in Virginia. You know what I mean? So, answer your question generally, I think it's usually a good idea to have the LLC if it's a Virginia property, you can have a Virginia LLC as the development entity, right? As the one that's gonna actually own and run the project. There are a whole lot of other questions that go along with syndication deals, but I hope that answers your question. I saw another hand, actually you, and then we'll go back in. Yep, yeah, go ahead.
How would you structure a partnership or LLC for married couple?
That's gonna be specific to the married couple, honestly. I don't mind, I've done partnership, I've done a lot of LLCs with the married couple just as 50-50, right? They can be 50-50, and then they can both be the managers depending. I've had it worked out several different ways. It really kind of depends, and I'll let me make this caveat here too, because I'm not a tax attorney. I'm not really giving tax advice, but you always want to have a good CPA and tax advisor, because I've seen LLCs with married couples where one of the spouses owns 1% to make sure that it's true partnership for tax reasons, and the other spouse owns 99% as the manager runs the whole thing. So there's a tax strategy in there, and then other LLCs where they're 50-50. They want to do it together, they both own it together, they want to run it together. So that's gonna be a specific question to the married couple. I've seen it also where a married couple is a 50-50, but only one spouse is the manager, because the other spouse is on another job. They're not gonna be around to sign anything. They trust their spouse. They're not gonna, you know what I mean? That's gonna be a couple by couple question. So, do you have
Like the protection, though, like from the legal perspective, do you recommend bringing in the husband and wife on the LLC, or just?
I'm not sure that I'm tracking with your question. If you have a married couple that want to start an LLC and they want to do it together,
I think he's talking about having just the husband as part of the LLC and leaving the wife out of it.
Because I'm thinking, like, for me, if I'm gonna set up LLC, I would just name it under me, just, so that, it will be under me. But if my wife say, hey, I wanna join you, so should I just bring her to LLC, or, I mean, you're
There's-
just
there-
gonna get the money anyway.
Yeah. Well,
So that's it.
yeah, I know that too. I know that. Yeah, and that's honestly, that would just be something we'd have to go through in specifics. I mean, there's not a general answer to that question. I mean, it's really gonna depend on a lot of different factors. That would be a really fact-specific thing, to be honest. Hold on, we got one. Go ahead.
Is there unnecessary hassle to using different LLCs from different states to buy or hold property in another state?
Well, yeah, I mean, you need to be registering, so it's what's called a foreign entity, right? So if you have, let's say you have a Delaware LLC, and you wanna use that Delaware, whoa, man. That Delaware LLC to flip homes in Virginia. You need to register that Delaware LLC in Virginia, you have to register to do business in Virginia, and then you have to pay the yearly fee with Virginia to do that too. So there are extra steps. The hassle of that can depend upon a lot of different factors, as far as why you have a Delaware LLC in the first place, like, again, it's all comes down to, what are your goals, what are you trying to accomplish? You're always starting from the end in any real estate deal. You guys are running numbers, right? You're investors, you run numbers, say, I wanna make X return, or I wanna make X dollars a month, or I'm looking to get, build up a portfolio of X number of units, right? You're starting from an end, right? And you're kind of always reverse engineering, how do I get to that, goal? What is my end? And that way I'll know how to properly structure what I'm doing to get to that end. So there are steps that you need to take. A bit of a debate, if a foreign entity just holds one property and it's not doing anything other than just holding one property, does it need to be registered in Virginia? I've seen it where like a North Carolina LLC will own a piece of property in Virginia, but it's not doing anything, it's not actually operating business in Virginia. There's some question about whether that needs to be registered, but in general, I don't think that's probably what you're talking about. You're talking about a foreign entity coming in to actually do business in the whatever.
Just like holding it to rent it out to someone else.
Yeah, it's probably safe to make sure that you, yeah, Lisa.
But the problem comes in is that you have to pay taxes under that. So reporting of the money goes back to the state in which you're registered at. So just be very careful with that.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Thank you, Lisa. You wanna make sure you get really good tax advice on that too, because some states, I believe it's California, and I don't wanna misrepresent this, but they don't care if you have a California LLC doing business in any other state, you make money in any other state, you still have to pay tax in California. Even if the property's not in California, if the business is not in California, you're still paying tax. Now, I believe that's the way it's set up for California, but that's ridiculous in my opinion. Why am I paying California taxes for something that has nothing to do with California, just because I'm using a California entity? Forget that, I'm gonna form an entity in Virginia and not even stress about necessarily. So, anyway, Jason, do you have another question?
Yeah, so, I'm just wondering what the difference is. Say, for example, you and I both have LLCs doing separate things completely.
Sure.
Then I find a property and I say, hey, let's buy this together. Is it different if we buy it as ourselves and form an LLC, or if we put our LLCs under the apartments LLC? Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
What's the difference there? Is it just liability, or how does that?
Yeah, I mean, you gotta think through, honestly, the administration, the paperwork of it. I know some people will always own their membership in LLC with another LLC. Ultimately, that always trickles down to an individual at some point.
Sure.
You know, an LLC, it's like a Russian nesting doll, right? It's just like, oh, it's another LLC, you know? So, yeah, I mean, honestly, again, the question is, what are we doing and what are we buying it for? What's the
Right.
purpose?
Right.
If there is a term called piercing the corporate veil in the legal world, when piercing the corporate veil is when you break through an entity's structure to say, hey, this is just a shell entity, it's not even real, we want to go after the owners, right? We're going to go after the people who actually own the company. The company's not even, hey, come on. It's not even a valid entity, or, it's, some do a separate bank account, never do a separate tax ID number. It's just, all they do is pay $100 to form an LLC. You know, it's a shell corporation, it's not operated like a real business. And then they get into a lawsuit with that, and then they say, well, where's your, where are your meeting minutes, or where is your operating agreement, or where's your bank account, or where's your tax ID number? Like, are you actually operating this as a business?
Right.
Right?
Is it just for show?
Right. It's just like, well, I have limited liability because I form an LLC. Like, no, you have to run it as a separate entity. It's technically a separate legal entity from you as an individual, which is the whole point. Lisa?
Question, but isn't it that I've heard that if you're only a single member of corporate LLC,
Yep.
then they can pierce the veil because of the single member?
That they cannot pierce
They
the
can't, because of a single member. That's why I've been told that you have to be very careful with single member LLC.
Yeah, I think that's important. I don't think it's not just an automatic that they will pierce it. It's not a default legal principle that if you're a single member LLC that is automatically pierced, because again, I've seen people who do whole developments and they only have a single member, which is one entity, right? So one LLC could own 100% of the other LLC. That's technically a single member LLC. But you do have to be careful, and you do have to make sure you're following the formalities. And again, the formalities, just to talk about that for a few minutes, you want to have the right documents. You want to have, when you form it, consent in lieu of the first meeting, just saying, hey, we're forming this, we're all on board, here's who the managers are, we're good to go, we're operating as a business. The operating agreement is essential. I think even in a single member LLC, if it's an individual who just owns LLC, banks usually won't even give you, let you open a bank account without an operating agreement for an LLC. Even if you're the sole member, you can just show up and say, yeah, I'm the sole member. Like, what do we have to show that? What is there to prove that? So operating agreements are very important. Tax ID numbers, you get a tax ID with the IRS, right? Or it's called an EIN, employee identification number. It's just the tax designation number for the entity, whether it's a corporation, LLC, or anything else. Our personal tax ID numbers are our socials, unless you get a separate tax ID number. So you want to make sure you have those formalities in place, and that you're running the business as a business, right? You want to make sure you're running the business as a business.
Kind of piggyback on his question, I think where you're going was, you've got two different LLCs doing two different things, and then
Yeah.
come together for this. Having each one of these LLCs as members of a joint LLC for a particular purpose
Yep.
does not preclude either one of those LLCs from doing the other business that they already were or want to do, right?
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So,
Is that where you're going?
Well, I was thinking more in terms of liability.
Yeah.
So what would be the smarter thing? Like if you and I both hold LLCs and we wanted to run this office building,
Mhm.
say we wanted to buy it and run it for the long haul,
yeah.
would we put our own names on the new LLC, or would we put our LLC's name on it?
Again, it does
That was
depend.
my question.
Right, it does depend on, so the question is, if you have again, let's say we're buying this,
For partnerships.
yeah, we're gonna buy this building that we're sitting in today, we're gonna buy this building. So the members or the owners of the LLCs, should those members be more LLCs, or can they be us individually? I mean,
What's the better way to go?
well, it depends on what is your exposure, what kind of asset are you doing, how are you operating it? Like, also, you're gonna need to talk to your tax person about, is it better to own my membership in this S corporation or that LLC that I already have? If you have an existing LLC that's already operating business, how does that affect the tax status of that LLC, owning another asset and getting those funds, and how that flows through? It's not, I hate to say it, it's just not a simple answer.
Right.
And really, it does depend on the situation, what your goals are, and how you're doing it. It's not a bad idea to own, if it's something very large, you can own membership in an LLC that you already have, right? Because again, it's just, you can layer the liability protection, but it gets cumbersome on an administrative level as well. The more, like I said, it's kind of the Russian nesting doll. It's an LLC with an LLC with an LLC, so. How you guys doing? You bored? No? Hold on one second. No?
Is it important, so if you form an LLC, say I have an LLC because I'm a real estate agent, my operating agreement, I'm a sole member and I have an operating agreement, isn't it, like with your question, if your LLC is because you own a hair salon, you can't necessarily go and do a real estate venture with a new LLC, right? You have to be working within the operating agreement of that
That depends on, yes, but that depends on how the operating agreement is drafted.
Right.
Most operating agreements drafted out there are saying the purpose of this entity is to do anything that you can legally do business in Virginia with, and specifically to run a real estate brokerage or whatever it is. Oftentimes they'll call out something specific, but then also have a general broad provision in there that says, but it can also operate for any other legal purpose that's allowed for a business in Virginia. There are people out there who say you don't want that, you want it only specific to the exact business you're doing and to limit it in that way. And you can do that, but it all depends on how the operating agreement is drafted. So if your operating agreement says the purpose of this entity is to invest in real estate, to own, manage, and operate real property investments, and also for any other legal purpose that an entity in Virginia can do business. That, under that operating agreement, you could go start a brokerage, you could go own a hair salon, you could go grow corn, or whatever else you wanted to grow. So,
Not legal.
not legal in Virginia.
And then what-
Medicinally, I guess it's, anyway, that's.
What does it cost? So one of the things earlier is the whole California LLC, $800 a year to have an LLC in California. So you don't wanna go racking up LLCs, but here, what is it?
So, yeah, it's $100 to form with the state. It's $50 a year, over and over. Now, I think in one of your questions was about registered agents. What does a registered agent do? So a registered agent for an LLC is the person that receives legal service on behalf of the entity. So let's say, Claudia, you form an LLC, you're your own registered agent, okay, and you have your home address as the registered agent's address. If there's any legal service on that entity, so if someone says, I'm gonna file a lawsuit, and then they serve papers on that legal entity, they're gonna serve it to the registered agent. And if you're not home, or you don't see it, or somehow you miss it, you could end up with a default judgment against that. So why most people have their attorneys as a registered agent, because anything legal that comes through the door for that entity is going to the registered agent. That's why they typically have their attorneys as a registered agent of their LLC. Perfect.
That service has a cost though, right? And what is
Yes.
it?
Well, so what's it? Yeah, so that's office by office specific. So for us, it's $200 a year to be the registered agent. And that typically includes the filing, the $50 filing fee, so.
So what's the disadvantage of having you being the registered agent and also the managing member of that
Well,
LLC?
the disadvantage of someone being their own registered agent is you don't always understand what you're receiving. If you're receiving legal service on behalf of your own entity, the question is, are you aware of everything that's coming through the door for that LLC? Like, if you get served legal papers, do you know what to do with them? Right? If you get sued, you got 21 days to respond. And if you miss it for the first 10 days, you better get on it and respond yourself, or go hire an attorney who can move heaven and earth to respond in those 11 days. Right? That's why it's important to, I believe, and I'm saying, I know this is self-serving, I'm an attorney, but I think it's important to have an attorney as a registered agent, because you get a lawsuit served on you, the attorney knows exactly what's going on, can inform you that you've been served, and then that clock is ticking, like right now. So there's enormous liability if you don't respond to certain legal service in a particular amount of time. But everyone, you have the right to be your own, any individual, any company in Virginia, or any law firm and or attorney can be a registered agent under the Virginia Limited Liability Act. But
So that's a cost, you say like $200 a year if you had a law firm as a registered agent?
that's what we charge. That varies. I know you can find attorneys out there who'll charge you $500 a year. You can probably find an attorney out there who might charge you less than that. But that is a cost. So you form a legal entity. Yeah, Lisa.
So just so everybody knows that if you don't actually live in Virginia, it has to be a registered agent in Virginia.
That's right. So you're
If
registered.
you move out of the area,
That's a good point. Yeah. So that's another good point. I appreciate that too. The registered agent has to be in Virginia. Your principal office address for the entity does not have to be in Virginia. Actually, I formed an LLC somewhat recently for a client, and their principal office address was New York City.
If you file, if you make your LLC in Virginia, you need to have your registered agent in Virginia.
Yes.
But if you do your LLC in
registered agent is gonna be in that state. Yep, and then, again, depending on what you're doing with that entity, if you domesticate it into Virginia, if you register it to do in Virginia, oftentimes you have to have a Virginia-specific address too, sometimes. So, but yeah, every state that I know of, the registered agent always, you have to have a registered agent in the state in which the entity is formed. So, yeah, Claudia.
So the registered agent information is public info.
Right.
And if you use your personal information, you're gonna get blown up by wholesalers, realtors, and everybody in between for all the properties you have.
Can you use PO box though?
No, cannot. The only time you can use a PO box is if you're in a very, very rural area. So that's the only
So that's
exception.
the address for the registered agent.
Well, yeah, or the principal office address. You cannot use a PO box as a principal office address, as the address for the business itself. You can't use a PO box unless it's in a very remote rural area. So, yeah, if you're in Norfolk or Virginia Beach or Chesapeake, you can't use a PO box.
So what is the difference in usage between the location of the registered agent and the location of the business? Does that make sense?
No.
Fantastic.
No, I'm not sure what you're asking.
So, we, as LLC aficionados, we have to provide a registered agent and also a business address.
Mhm.
What is why do they need two, and what are each of those addresses used for in various different circumstances?
Again, the office address, you just have to have a place that you're doing business out of, right? So that's what the office address is for.
And what would that be used for? That's my question.
It's on the public records, it's where you're literally using, like, operating your business out of. Right,
I
so
understand
it's not used particularly for anything, it's a requirement of the state that you have it.
Can that be a PO box?
No, again, so you cannot have a PO box unless you're in a rural, like an extremely rural area.
Right.
But the registered agent is again, the agent and their address, that's where all legal service goes to.
Right.
On behalf of the entity.
And so that's what I'm saying, is that the address of the registered agent is used to receive legal correspondence.
Right.
The address of the business is to receive
Junk mail.
Junk mail, everything else, basically.
Yeah, basically everything else.
Okay.
But it's also what you put on the public records to say, this is where I'm operating my business. Again, every business has to have an address. I mean, the way that Virginia set it up, the legal structure of it.
Sure.
So,
Okay.
yeah.
I don't know if this would be qualified as a loophole, but I have that situation, and I use as my office. There's a UPS store. UPS stores are physical addresses that have boxes. My understanding, and I've been told by multiple people, is they are legal. You cannot use a PO box, but you can use a box at a UPS store as your
It's a
physical
virtual
address.
address, right?
Correct.
Is that-
Kind of, yeah.
I do that.
I'm not, yeah, I've seen that too. I've had clients who wanted to use those. I haven't found anything in the Virginia code that would say otherwise. It cannot be a PO box, but if it ends up being like 2000 Virginia Beach Boulevard, number 171C, and that's a box at a
Physical address.
yeah, the UPS store, I don't know, I haven't run into anything that would disqualify that. So, yes.
Now, if you own a rental property, it's suggested that should be under a LLC.
Uh-huh.
Right, suppose if you have more than one, suppose you have two rental properties,
Mhm.
can you have the same LLC in both properties? Is
Mhm.
it?
You can,
Well,
yes.
but is that the best way to go, or should you have, for each rental property, have an LLC for each?
Well, that's gonna be a little bit specific to the person, the investor, and here's why. I've got clients who say, you know what, I'm putting a threshold, a dollar amount, a value amount threshold on an LLC. I'm not holding more than $1 million worth of real estate in any one LLC. I've got other clients who say, you know what, I don't wanna own more than 4 properties in any one LLC. Because you have to understand that with every LLC, it's registered agent costs, potentially, if you want a registered agent. It's administrative costs, you're setting up a new bank account, you're having to file a separate tax return for every LLC, right? Even though it could be a pass-through entity, you still need to have, you still need to account for that. So there's a huge administrative cost. So if you have 20 rental properties and you have 20 LLCs, it's a lot of books. It's a lot of tax returns. It's a pretty big, that administrative cost can get really high.
Well, also the time with all the minutes and everything might.
Yeah, exactly. It's a balance, and then that really comes down to your risk threshold. You know, how many properties, where are the properties, what are the values of the properties? If I have 3 houses down towards the ocean front, you know, and I have, you know, whatever, like high net worth renters that are really litigious, I might want 3 LLCs for those things. Or if I have a couple of duplexes that are $100,000 to $150,000 with really easy tenants who are just happy to be in them in Norfolk, maybe I can hold 4 of those in LLC. You know, you're gonna navigate those kind of waters depending on what your risk threshold is, and depending on, you know, how much of time you have to administrate all these things. Erica, do you have another question?
Yeah, real quick, what is the process for if I own a property in my personal name and I now want to move it into an LLC?
Sure. So we're presuming that we formed the LLC, right?
Yes.
It's the LLC's formed, we've got the operating agreement, we got all the organizational documents. You got your separate tax ID number for it. Say, okay, I own a duplex, I wanna throw that duplex in an LLC to protect my liability. It's a very, very simple process. The first question I'd ask is, do you have debt on the property, right?
The answer is yes.
Okay, so we'll run down that rabbit trail. What's that? Oh. I thought you wanted to chime in. So it's a very simple process of deeding it into an LLC. So do you own the LLC 100%?
This is hypothetical.
Yes, yeah.
50-50 with my husband.
Okay, so what I've done in that scenario is I do what's called a deed of gift, right? Deed of gift is a transfer in Virginia. I don't like quitclaim deeds. I'm gonna rail against them very briefly. Quitclaim deeds don't give you much protection. They can be useful in specific circumstances, but in general, there's no warranty with a quitclaim deed. A quitclaim deed is just saying, hey, I'm not saying that I own anything, but if I do own anything, it's yours, right? That's literally what a quitclaim deed is. A deed of gift is saying, hey, I own this, I'm transferring all of my rights under that, either through a general warranty or special warranty deed, but we don't have to get into those specifics really, but you deed a gift to say, I'm gifting this property. Let's say you own it individually and you want to put it in an LLC that you and your husband own 50-50. You just do a deed of gift.
How is that spelled? Is that deeded gift or deed of gift?
Deed of gift. Deed of gift. 1 second. So in Virginia, when you transfer property and there's no consideration, meaning there's no sales price, they have tax exempt codes when you transfer property under certain circumstances so that they don't charge you a transfer tax. They just charge you a recording fee, and that's usually like $30 or less. So in that scenario, put together a deed of gift. It comes from you to the LLC for no consideration whatsoever, and then the LLC owns it. So to make sure that you're complying with the tax code, you would have to own at least 50% of that LLC, right? Because they want to make sure that people aren't circumventing transfer taxes in that way. But if you own 50% of the LLC, your husband owns 50%, and you own the property outright yourself, you just need to gift it into it, and then the LLC owns it. That's that simple as far as the ownership. Now with the debt, everyone talks about due on sale clauses, right? Transferability and everything. Yeah, so that's, the bank has the right to call the note if they want, right? If you have a mortgage on a property and you transfer any part of that property, not even the whole thing, into anyone else's name, even if you still own part of it, right? If you transfer any of it, technically, that can be considered a default under your deed of trust, under your debt. So that's a legal reality. The practical reality, I have yet to see any bank call a note that is performing. Doesn't mean they can't. Doesn't mean they can't. I have not seen it happen. I've not seen it happen. I've helped a lot of clients put investment properties into LLCs, and as long as you're paying your mortgage, the cost for a mortgage company to foreclose on a property is actually enormous. It's enormous. And they don't want the property on their books. They're not interested in keeping the property. They're not looking to keep the property. They want you to perform on the note. They want you to pay the mortgage. So the practicality of it is, I've not seen a bank ever call a note? Could a bank call a note? Yes. I have contingencies and ideas for how to deal with that if that ever would happen, right? There's something called a cure period and curing of the default. Honestly, what I'd probably do is I'd say, okay, no problem, just deed it back to the original person who had the deed of trust, right? And then the default technically is cured at that point. But I haven't had to do that because I've never seen someone call a note.
On that, it was a trig, and I don't remember which one it was, but the reason they don't call the note due is because when the bank goes through the foreclosure process, they have to raise their reserve amount of money, so there's money that they can't put to work because they have to raise the reserves. That's
Right.
why they're just kind of like, oh, that's annoying, I'm not gonna say anything, but,
Yeah, and again, banks, lenders typically have so many mortgages out there. If the note's being paid, they tend to be in general, on autopilot. They're not gonna be, if they have millions of mortgages or even hundreds of thousands of mortgages, if someone transfers one from an individual LLC, but the note keeps getting paid, that's not necessarily gonna rise to their on their radar. So I always have to give both. So are you technically could they call a default on the deed of trust? They could. Have never seen it happen. Not saying it won't happen, but have not seen it happen. Especially on a typical residential mortgage, right? I mean, if you're talking about commercial mortgages, I mean, with banks, that's a bit of a different thing. There's a question, gentlemen. You don't? Okay. All right. Yes, sir.
Going back to the gifting, so are you saying it will be tax exempt for state and federal?
No, it's not. It's exempt from transfer taxes. In Virginia, whenever property changes hands, this is the state getting their money, right? There's a tax that's charged to the person selling the property and the person buying the property. There's a grantor's tax and a grantee's tax. Grantee is buyer, grantor is a seller. Okay, those are just legal terms so you know. But there's a transfer tax, right? That's not the actual real estate tax that the cities charge on a
How
yearly
about
basis.
gift tax?
A gift tax? Oh, that's a completely separate question that I have to let you ask your tax professional. But what we're talking about here is you gifting it into an LLC that you own.
But it's still a gift, right?
Yeah, it is, but I mean, are LLCs subject to inheritance tax?
Because LLC
No.
is, it depends, if it's, I think if it has separate EIN, and also it has to file separate tax.
Sure. It's not subject to the same type of, from my understanding, it's not subject to the same type of gift tax liability that individuals are necessarily. You gotta make sure that you're accounting for it. Like the LLC, when you file the tax return for the LLC, it's gonna show the property as an asset, right? But as far as gift tax, Lisa, do you wanna?
Yeah, so it
Chime
all
in?
depends on how your LLCs are set up. If your LLCs are set up, ours are set up as joint between the two of us. We transfer all, 11 or 12 of them into the LLCs. Not one has been called, by the way, it's been about 15 years, just to let y'all know. But the big thing to understand, when you transfer, so ours are set up as joint tax or joint returns, right? It gives them, when you're into the LLC, that LLC goes back to our personal returns in a K1, and that K1 gets transferred back to us. So as long as you're reporting it, there is really no gift tax. It is all you.
You're still paying the same price.
It's a circle, but it's all coming back to you, so there's no gift tax.
Right, so, again, I have to draw some pretty clear lines as far as the tax advice, so thank you for chiming in on that. But the logistics of that is you have an LLC, when you file a tax return for an LLC, if it's a pass-through entity, which when you have a pass-through entity, that means all the money is passing through the LLC to the owners, right? The LLC as an entity is not getting taxed itself. So if you have a C corporation, that corporation pays tax on that, all the money that comes in. And then if that pays money out to the owners, then the owners get taxed on that money as well. An S corporation, which is a small, closely held corporation, and an LLC, typically, they can be designated differently, but they're pass-through entities, which means that, like, if my LLC makes all the money, it just ends up flowing right down to my tax liability personally, right? That's just kind of the general rule. The LLC still has to file a tax return. But when that LLC files a tax return, there are what Lisa just said, there are K1 statements, and the K1 statements are what designate, hey, I own 40%, so I have 40% of the tax liability for all the money that flowed through. Lisa has 60% of that LLC, she has 60% of the tax liability that, so that the K1 statements are then what you take to your personal tax file and say, hey, I made all this money through this LLC, I've gotta make sure I account for that on my personal tax returns. So that's just, again, just to give you some context and yeah,
When you, let's say for the example we just talked about, where you transfer the property from your name into an LLC, are you able to adjust the balance of the property value by the land value?
No, I'm not, are you talking about the tax basis? Are you talking about the tax basis?
Not sure whether that ends up being the tax basis, but let's say you have a property that's worth $300,000, that's including the land value, and you buy it, and the house is worth 200, land's worth 100.
Sure.
Then you turn that over to your LLC.
Right.
And you then adjust that ratio as you transfer it over.
That's like for depreciation, right?
Yeah. Are you talking about for depreciation? Well, no, so there's no consideration, there's no sales price with a deed of gift. It's just changing the ownership structure. It's just changing the ownership structure. So if that's getting into the weeds a little bit, but there's a tax basis when you buy something for 100 grand and you hold it for 10 years and sell it for 300 grand, your tax liability is typically, with a whole lot of caveats, is that 200 grand that you paid, right? Because you put 100 grand into it, and it's appreciated up to 300, so that 200 is your tax liability. So the city, on a tax assessment side, the city sets the value of the land and the improvement, not you. If you're talking about the basis as far as your depreciation schedule and everything, again, that's something you probably need to talk to your tax professional about. But I'm not sure that I'm totally tracking with you. Like, why are you trying to readjust the value of the land and the building versus the? Is he talking about for depreciation? Yeah. Again, because there's no consideration changing hands, I would say the most likely answer, and you can verify this, is that the LLC is going to inherit whatever basis and whatever depreciation schedule that the individual already was on. Most likely. That's most likely, but I would encourage you to verify. Yes, ma'am, behind the comment there. Yeah.
So what are the benefits of like switching over to your LLC? Like, why would you want to do that?
Liability. So if you have a property and someone sues you and you own it personally, they can go after all of your own personal assets. If that LLC owns just that property and something happens and they sue the owner who's the LLC, they can only go after what the LLC owns. So that LLC owns just that property. Even if that person wins, that judgment and that lawsuit can only be attached to, and they can only go after whatever assets the LLC owns. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Well, that's kind of my question in regards to the street trading as far as liability. In the scenario, there's a single member LLC and you deed it to give to the LLC.
Right.
I mean, how does liability work in that situation if you still have a debt on, or have you still have a mortgage and
Right.
in your personal name,
Mhm.
but then you give it to the LLC, if you're sued, does that make it easier for the bail to be pierced or you're still covered?
No, not necessarily. Not if you've formed the entity property and are running the entity properly. Is it more likely for a single member LLC to be pierced? I mean, there are some attorneys out there who say yes, and you just got to make sure you're keeping up the formalities and running it as an actual company, right? But as far as the debt is concerned, you're still personally liable if you sign personally on a note, right? But that doesn't change your debt liability, but your legal liability as far as who's on the property, if a tenant you're having to deal with a tenant or anything of that nature, that is shifted to the entity that owns it, provided that's being owned and operated, is operated properly. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay, great. Yes, ma'am.
So if you have a rental property and you get sued before you set up an LLC, could you go out and set up an LLC?
You could. Courts are wise about that. They're not gonna let you try to, like, if you know that a lawsuit's coming, even if you know that a lawsuit's coming, or if it's already been filed, right? It's too late at that point. It's too late. Courts will reach back, even if you end up transferring. Most often they'll reach back on it. So yes, sir.
So follow what she said. If you've got substantial debt on the property and it's in an LLC, you get sued. say the courts, they seize the home or whatever, you still owe this debt to the bank, but the home has been seized. I mean, what kind of complications, I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, so typically a court's not gonna seize the property. So if you get sued, let's just use an example. Someone like falls into a hole that's on the property that wasn't properly marked, or that wasn't, that should have been covered up or filled in or whatever, right? Say there's negligence on your part as a landlord, as a landowner, and they successfully sue you and they win in court. That $50,000 judgment, right, is going to go against whoever they're the plaintiff, you're the defendant. That $50,000 judgment is going to go against the defendant, right? So if you own an LLC, it goes against the LLC. That judgment is only enforceable against the LLC on whatever the LLC owns. So if the LLC only owns the property, that judgment will attach to the property. It will attach to the property, but they don't start garnishing the wages of the LLC unless the LLC, maybe they can go and enforce it to whatever rental income you got on the property potentially. They can go through that rigmarole, but the courts don't take the property back from you. That's more of like a bankruptcy situation or a civil forfeiture, which is not really what we're talking about here. So your debt, your personal liability on the debt is very different than your legal liability as a landowner, right? If you stop paying the mortgage, the bank can take the property after foreclosure. If you're sued by a tenant, right? If you're sued by a tenant, they can only attach a judgment to whatever that LLC owns. Does that make sense? A distinction?
Yeah, but the LLC owns that home, so
Right.
let's just say the judgment is for the full value of the home. But you're saying they can only just attach a judgment to it, but they can't actually.
Right, they can just try to enforce and collect on that, right? So ultimately, if they get a big enough judgment, could they try to enforce it and force you to sell it or take the home? That's a possibility.
Okay.
But they can only go after whatever is in that LLC. Right, the bigger problem is if you own it personally, and they can go after everything else you own. So, yes, sir, your question?
Can you touch on what kind of impact the Corporate Transparency Act of 2019 might have on real estate investors forming LLCs?
The Corporate Transparency Act, you say?
Yeah. So in August, it was passed, and it's supposed to be, makes it easier for law enforcement to pierce the veil and go after.
Are you talking about civil forfeiture? Give me a scenario of what you're talking about.
So if you've got, I think the core concept of it is to try to, it's trying to prevent embezzling and money laundering.
Mm-hmm.
So it's trying to make it easier to drill down and find out who exactly is profiting from the operations of the LLC, but the possible concern could be the lack of privacy or possibly increased exposure of your information, because law enforcement no longer has to get a warrant or, there's less work for them to do to find out who's involved in running the LLC and profiting from it.
Well, let me say this. This is going to be one of those scenarios where I'm going to need to look into that a little more. In general, I would say, A, you really don't need to worry about that if you're embezzling or trying to launder money through your LLC or your real estate. But B, I think it's also, I think you want to think about on a broader sense. If you're gonna get sideways with law enforcement, that tends to be, again, this is a totally different topic, but state and federal governments tend to have a lot more powers to do things that other people don't do. But that's a very specific criminal context.
Yeah, because the extension of that could be, how much easier is it now for lawyers to get that information to try to go after you, and you erode that protection of the LLC, like the Delaware LLC? Does that have any impact?
But
That's what I'm curious
if the Corporate Privacy Act is applicable in a criminal context, then not at all, right? Unless you end up in a criminal case with your LLC and your real estate, and that comes out in the court records. Anything that ends up in the court records becomes public record, right? But in that context, for me, if I'm going to say, if I'm going to sue someone, that's a civil suit, right? It's not a criminal suit, and so it's just typically a different context.
Yeah. I just didn't know if you had some additional insight on if there were other things buried in there that.
No,
exposed.
I can't say that I know, if that came in August, I can't say that I know that act well enough specifically to answer that question, so. But anyway.
With the gift,
Yep.
to the LLC,
Mm-hmm.
who should be making the payments on the mortgage? The LLC, correct? Like all,
I mean, you can do that again, I mean, are you gonna be writing physical checks? Are you gonna be
well,
like doing the
who-
banks, I mean?
No, I'm saying, like, the
You're-
setup
you're-
earlier was,
Yeah, you're talking about from a structural standpoint.
Mhm.
If the LLC is taking the money in from the rent,
Mhm.
I would have the LLC pay the mortgage.
okay.
Yeah, again, I'm sorry, that, I think
So you'd have a bank account with LLC's name on it.
every time. If you're gonna operate like a business, I mean, you name me a business outside of some, maybe not so honest or upright business, pretty much every business has its own bank account. Lisa?
Somebody was over there talking about the rents and stuff like that. One mistake that I see a lot of owners make is they don't update their leases with their LLC information on it. So make sure you update your leases and make sure you do it annually, because the longer they go, you'll never know when you need to refinance something and you need a current lease. So you should always be paying attention to your lease end dates.
That's a really good point as well. Yes, ma'am.
So is it easier to like buy personal property and then put it into an LLC, or set up an LLC first, and then buy like investment property, and then how does this like the whole mortgage work? Is it just like backed by the property or any future rents, or how does that work?
Yeah, that really depends on the kind of loan you're getting and the kind of money you're getting.
Banks doesn't usually lend to LLC.
Yeah, so in general, banks are not as interested in loaning to LLCs. They're not as interested in loaning to LLCs because it's harder to hold people accountable in many respects from a lending standpoint. Because if you hold something in LLC and you borrow money in LLC, again, you can switch around ownership inside that LLC in a lot of respects, which again, under most banks and their loan documents would be a violation of the loan itself. Because they typically say you can't switch up ownership after the fact, otherwise we can call the note due. But, I mean, that's a lending question in some sense, but I know a lot of people who have a hard time, if you're getting private money, hard money, whatever, but if you're getting institutional financing, in general, they're not as keen on, lending to LLCs, some will, but you're gonna have a higher interest rate just by the nature of the loan. So, Taylor, do you wanna?
Let's say you buy the house in your name.
Uh-huh.
And you're a scaredy cat of the due on sale clause. Are there other ways to protect your asset and your liability other than the LLC? The LLC is it.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you own it personally, you're on the hook. You're the responsible party. You own the property. So,
We have like a dozen properties, we bought them all in our personal name, transferred them into an LLC, said, ooh, look at these rates. Transferred them back into our personal name, refinanced them, transferred them back to, so if there was some kind of trigger out there, I would've hit it.
thanks, Eric.
Don't be scared.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for giving that. That's kind of case in point again. I have to let me make sure I make the legal distinction. The banks have a right to do it, but the practical reality is I've never seen it. And there's, in a case of 15 years of transferring back and forth between LLC and personal name.
Said, ooh, rates are at 4.5. Back
Yep.
to our personal names to
But,
get that rate.
but that actually goes to the other question, is that you're not gonna get 4.5 with an LLC. You're gonna get 5.5 or 6 maybe, right? Because it's an investor loan, and it's an investor loan with a company versus an individual.
Well,
What's
commercial
that?
loans.
Commercial loans?
Yeah.
So- well, yeah, commercial loans are a bit of a different animal. I mean, if you're going to a bank and getting a commercial loan, you can definitely borrow through an LLC, but those are typically 5, 10 years, at best 20-year loans. You're not gonna get a 30-year fixed rate commercial loan with any bank that I know of. I know people who are 8, 9 figure wealth, who are borrowing money from banks, and none of them are getting 30-year fixed loans on their commercial properties. The best I've seen is 20, and that's on a very stable asset.
But at some
So,
point, they have to go to that, but you can only have 10 conventional, 10 loans in your.
you have 10 and then 1 for the residents
But
typically.
then they
right?
just grow out of single-family homes and just start buying apartments, and that's okay.
There you go. Yeah.
So I had a question about the K1. So you said
Yep.
that the K1 is just the documentation of pass-through income.
Right.
And so what happens if the LLC decides to not pay out that year? Is that
No,
legal?
So that's actually a fair
So-
question, but if an entity, let's say you have an LLC that makes $100,000,
Yes.
and you own 50% of the entity,
Yep.
you're gonna get K1 for $50,000 tax liability. Even if that entity holds on to all that money for operating purposes, you still have tax liability on whatever that entity.
So there's no tax savings if you withhold it from reinvesting or anything like that?
Yeah,
You
see,
can't-
that's, there are strategies for that, but that's really the weeds, and you can talk to a CPA about that,
Right.
or a tax attorney. But in general, if an LLC shows that they've made money, they show that they've made money, and you end up with a K1, you are responsible for that tax liability,
Right.
right? So if it shows that I made 50 grand out of the LLC, even though that money wasn't actually distributed, I still have a $50,000 tax liability. I'm gonna
Right,
deal
but
with.
that's assuming that you got your K1 that says $50,000.
Right, which
So
you're
that-
gonna get if you file a tax return and you own 50% of an LLC.
I see,
Isn't that
so
only
that-
true if it's taxed as an S corp?
What's that?
Isn't that only true if it's taxed as an S corp? Because
No, not.
otherwise you file Schedule C. If you're a totally disregarded entity.
Yeah.
Aren't you a
yeah,
CPA?
What's that? Yeah, I'm gonna have to eject right there.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Two quick questions.
Mhm.
One, to go back to the ownership discussion real quick.
Mhm.
I was once told that, if you were single, and you got married, and, you and your spouse both own property separate, aside from like LLC situation, if you didn't wanna form that, you can just add each other's names to.
To the title?
property, to the
Sure.
title.
Mhm.
So that
We could do
way,
that.
if someone sues one of the one of the spouses,
Mhm.
then they can't necessarily come after them as far as, I wanna say, that property is concerned,
Mhm.
because they own it
Together.
together. Like,
Yeah.
like how
That's,
how true of a level of protection that is?
so you're asking about the way you hold title of the property in Virginia. This is just a broader question than LLC. So the most protective way you can hold as an individual is as a married couple. So you can hold title in fee simple. If you own it yourself, you own it in fee simple. If you own it with another person, you can own it as a tenant in common or as a joint tenants with the right of survivorship. And that's not just one other person, it can be multiple people. So joint tenants with the right of survivorship means that Jason and I own a property. Jason, John and I own a property, actually, I love that. We all three own a property, we own it equally. We own it as joint tenants with the right of survivorship. If I were to die, then my 1/3 ownership would equally distribute and they would automatically own it by operation of law. That's the right of survivorship, right? So in Virginia, when you own property as a married couple, it's called tenants by the entirety with the right of survivorship. And what the scenario you're giving is why that's the best way to hold property as individuals is because exactly what you're saying, that if I were to get in a car wreck, let's say I'm married, I own property, it's tenants by the entirety, we own it as a married couple, right? If I were to get in a car wreck and someone sues me and they win, and they get a judgment against me specifically, that judgment does not attach to the property because we own the property as a married couple. If my wife and I are in the car and we get sued jointly, and then there would have to be a judgment against both of us to attach that property that we own as a married couple. So
that would be.
It doesn't protect you. It doesn't protect you from liability in the sense that we're talking about as far as the LLC, but it does protect you in liability as far as an individual judgment versus a judgment between you and your spouse.
Right. So then that wasn't the good advice to have each person's.
Yeah, if you're gonna hold, if you're married and you hold property and you guys are 50-50 in it, you should absolutely hold it as tenants by the entirety of the right of survivorship. If you're not gonna hold it in an LLC or separate structure, but again, there's just so many scenarios there, personal residences, there's revocable trusts, there's there's all sorts of things, but in general, yes. There is a protection, an extra protection to holding property as a married couple, because any judgment that gets levied against you is only gonna be applied to that property if it's levied against both you as a married couple. But then if you're divorced, I'll go in that.
What would be the process to affect that?
What's that?
What would be the process to affect that change? So
Deed of gift. If it depends, if let's say, again, you each hold property individually, and then you get married, and you wanna put each other on the properties, all you would do is a deed of gift for both those properties. You would go from you to you and your spouse on the one property. On the other one property, the spouse would go from them to you and the spouse. And then you would end up, the deed of gift is just a simple transfer. There's no transfer tax on that, so.
As far as our LLCs are concerned, when you form it, you get going,
Yep.
you start doing business and stuff like that.
Mhm.
As far as protections and things of that nature is concerned, how important is it? How important is it to have like record keeping of like meetings and
It's important.
things of that nature in case something happens?
Yeah.
Say, yes, we actually is running this like a business.
Yep.
Or if you don't do it, because I've also heard that if you didn't do it as an LLC, it's not a big deal because that type of stuff is more lax because it's not like.
There are not as many
corporation.
there's not nearly as many formalities with an LLC as there are with a corporation. But I highly suggest if you do form an LLC, and let's say you own it as a sole 100%, you go take a trip one weekend a year, just say, hey, I had a meeting with myself, my LLC. Maybe you write it off if you get that okay from your CPA. But just to have an annual meeting, right? An annual meeting to think about, like, just say, hey, we're operating this business, this is the way things are going, this is where we've done, and just have the more formality you can have about it. It doesn't have to be cumbersome or overly, detailed per se, but the more formality you can have about it. You have the operating agreement, you have the right formation documents, you have the bank account, you have the separate tax records, you have the separate books for the LLC, right? So all the money flowing through it, you're saying that that's separate. You're getting separate tax returns. Having one meeting a year, not very cumbersome. Just put that in writing to say, hey, the LLC met this year, I'm the manager, I'm the owner, or me and my spouse were the owners, and we met, and we had a meeting, and we talked about this and this and that, and we put it and formalized it in writing. So the more formality you can have, the better off you'll be if you just end up in a scenario where you end up having to prove that you actually run it like a business. So, yes, sir.
Just going back to the first thing of legal, can you give an example of like things that you do that can trigger that one? Because I know some people they set up this LLC and these different bank accounts, but when they actually operate the business, sometimes they use the business card for personal transactions or vice versa. So can you just...
No, there are way too scenarios for me to go through that necessarily, but the example you gave is a very good one. If you're commingling, that's a very fun legal term. If you're commingling funds, if you're buying things personally for your personal house or your residence, if you're buying your groceries with the LLC card, or through that bank account, that's not good. If you have other businesses or income that's going into that LLC's account, if there's not clear records and clear demarcation between what the LLC is doing as a business, what you're doing as individually, or as another business is doing, you just want to think of it as like setting up proper firewalls in between what you're doing. And that, if you're using the business card, the LLC card, you're using it for the business purposes, right? And any money or income that's coming in from the rental is coming into that LLC, right, into that bank account. And then it can funnel out to you personally after that. You can do distributions, but it's got to be going through the right channels. So you had a question in the middle there.
Yeah, quick question. In terms of, you mentioned irrevocable trust, between that and having an LLC, what are the advantages, disadvantages, and is one better than the other?
Yeah, no liability protection with the trust. No liability. There can be very real tax advantages, like estate tax advantages, but you don't have any extra liability protection if you own it in a trust. It's as if you own it yourself in that sense. So,
going back to Erica's, so she said she formed the LLC properly, put a rental property into it.
Yep.
Now, are you allowed to put your primary resident into that LLC?
could.
pay rent to the LLC and then the rent pays the mortgage.
Yeah, I mean, you could do that if you wanted to do that. If you're worried about potential liability on your property, if you own a pool
You don't
or
wanna sue
like.
yourself?
What's that?
You might volunteer yourself, is that?
Nowadays, people are doing Airbnb by
Makes
rooms.
sense.
Yep.
And
So you got
Yeah.
Airbnb guys coming in every weekend.
That's a great idea. That's a good point.
I don't
Yeah,
know.
yeah, no, yeah, you absolutely, you can put your
Business.
personal residence in LLC.
Okay.
You can absolutely do that. I did that for a client probably about 2 weeks ago. I mean, it's, again, that kinda goes back to if you're just living in your house, you know, unless you have a bunch of people coming through all the time that you worry about, but,
Daycare. We got daycare.
yeah, if you run a daycare business, we'll have a separate conversation about that. That's a
Oh,
but-
not me. No,
I just mean in general. But no, that's a totally fair point. People are doing Airbnb for rooms in their house.
Yeah.
It's not, it's not necessarily a bad idea to,
You know,
what's that?
Events,
Yeah.
wedding
Yeah,
parties, whatever.
yeah, absolutely. You can think about that. You just have to, again, you're gonna count the cost of the administration of that and thinking through like why you have that. And if you own 1 or 2 rental properties here and then you wanna put your personal residence in there, you're putting one of your largest assets in that liability pool if something happens with that LLC, right? So again, just thinking through all those scenarios. Yes, sir.
If you've got an LLC owns a property and you put that LLC into a trust, do you lose any of the liability protections? The trust owns the LLC.
The trust is the beneficiary of the LLC?
Yeah.
No, you still have liability protection in that scenario. But the trustee of the trust is gonna be an individual. That trustee doesn't necessarily have personal liability, but they're gonna be on the public records and they're gonna be the ones that are control it. But yeah, I know, I've got clients who do put LLCs as a beneficiary of their trust to try and maintain some of that. And that kinda goes back to the revocable trust question. What's that?
Not the beneficiary of the trust. The trust, like, if you say you died, the LLC then becomes an irrevocable trust, or it's owned by the trust.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite track
So
that.
the property's owned by the LLC, the
Yep.
LLC is owned by the trust.
Oh, I see. I see what you're saying. No, you still have liability protection there. If the LLC is the one, whoever owns the property, that's who's gonna be liable. So you could have a trust own an LLC. That gets in a pretty complicated structure, but you could definitely do that. Absolutely. Again, I definitely have clients. I've got a great wills and estates attorney in my office who helps, I work hand in hand with on that kind of stuff too. But you got a question?
Can you talk about purchasing properties subject to contracts? And-
Sure, that's definitely a
3 more questions, just to let you know.
3 more questions?
I don't wanna take up your whole night, so I wanna make sure that we have
No,
a
that's okay.
stopping point for you.
Okay.
So sorry, guys, I wanna be respectful of
No problem.
vacation time.
How long have we been going?
We're just chatting away.
Gracious. Okay, subject to, we'll shift into that. Who has done a subject to deal in here? 2, 3.
Can you explain that?
I will.
Okay.
That's kind of the thrust of the question. I just wanted to see how much context we had in the room for it. So a subject to deal is when you buy a property and you take ownership, right? You take ownership of the property, but you take it subject to the existing mortgage. So the existing mortgage is in the seller's name and it stays in the seller's name. That's a subject to deal. Okay? So I've been doing that for several years now with clients. Again, that really goes back to, Eric and Lisa were talking about, especially if, as a case in point, that's a serious, that's a transfer of title, not just from you to you, or LLC that you own, to a completely unrelated party, right? And if the mortgage is getting paid, again, I have not seen a bank call a note, as long as the mortgage is getting paid. So there are several scenarios in which that could make sense. I am personally pretty particular about clients that I work with that do subject to deals, because I've been on both sides of it and seen it go really wrong. I had a client who was already way down the road, signed the contract. I wasn't able to get them out of the contract per se, and they sold it to an investor on a subject to deal and calls me 2 months later saying, this person's not paying my mortgage at all. I'm dropping out of school because I'm getting calls 4 times a day from my lender. I can't handle this. I'm like, I don't know. If if you wanna gear up and try to do a loss, the problem is you sold it to someone who wasn't very liquid, who wasn't very honest, and who didn't follow through on what they said they were gonna do. I've got clients who are very good and well capitalized and are very honest and ethical and do what they say they're gonna do, and make sure that they say, we're gonna, no matter what, your mortgage is getting paid, and if anything weird goes crazy, then we're either gonna sell it and pay the holding off, or we're gonna refinance it out of your name, right? So I'm pretty particular about clients that I do subject to deals with, because I wanna make sure that they understand how they're doing them, they understand how they work, and even if someone's new in it, who's committed to making sure that they actually get things done, and done the right way. Because like I said, I've got clients who've done very well at that, and other clients, I've been on the other side where just had the clients get screwed in that kind of scenario. So when you buy the property, let's say it's a property in Virginia Beach, it's worth maybe 200 grand, they owe 150 on it, right? And you say, listen, I'll give you 5,000 bucks, I'll buy the property from you. They're not able to pay the mortgage, they're in just whatever situation, say, I don't have the money to fix it up to get it market ready, there's not enough delta there for me to actually fix it up and sell it right. So I'll sell it to you as is, completely as is, I'll take 5,000 bucks and you take over my mortgage, right? And that's someone just an example of how someone could do a subject to deal. So at the closing, the seller gets 5 grand, the buyer does all the costs, and then they get all the information needed from the seller, say, okay, now I have authorization, now I have a power of attorney, now I have every right to talk to your lender on your behalf, and I have your account number so I can make sure that I'm paying the mortgage off every month. And then someone can say, okay, I'm gonna take that property, I'm gonna fix it up and flip it and make whatever, or I'm gonna take that property and pay that mortgage off at 150 grand, that could be, 1,100 bucks a month, and I can rent for 1,700 bucks, I'm just gonna make the spread back. Lisa?
Have you ever seen it where somebody requires like an attorney's office to handle the mortgage payment, like escrow account?
I've seen that, I don't do that, I won't do that. I don't like that, frankly, because of the liability. What's that?
It protects both parties at that time.
Yeah, but again, that, to me, that goes back to, what's that?
It would come with a fee, but at
That would have to
least,
come with a fee, I'm sure.
Yeah, but,
like, that person wouldn't have got screwed if your office was a part of that, making sure it was getting done, that's all I'm saying.
yeah, again, I'll talk for myself personally. Either my client that's buying it is honest and has integrity, is gonna make sure it gets done, and I have confidence in them. The liability for me having to pay someone's mortgage, the fees on that, and the money running through my accounts, and the reconciliation that has to happen, and all of the ridiculous, bookkeeping that goes along with that, I just don't even want the hassle. I'm not gonna deal with a client I'm worried about that, frankly. I've heard of that done, but that's just not something we do as a firm, frankly. And there are other ways too, on subject to deals. I know people who say, you know what, we'll do a pocket deed. What a pocket deed is, so the buyer says, I'm buying it, I'm taking over your mortgage. If I miss up to 60 days of payments, I'm signing a deed right now that's getting held by, I have done this, that's getting held by the attorney, and if we're at least 2 payments late, probably automatically goes back to the seller. And any buyer investor who's invested whatever money and time, energy, effort, tens of thousands of dollars to get it rehabbed and to get it done, they're gonna find a way to make sure that mortgage is paid. Because they have something hanging over their head, and that's also kind of a backstop for sellers at times too. Not everyone does that, but some of my clients will do that just because they think, as a buyer, they think it's the right thing to do, is to protect the seller and to give them assurance and a good feeling to say, hey, I'm gonna follow through, and if I don't follow through, you just get the property back, and I lose all the money that I put into it. So that's another backstop, and some people use that as a really strong selling point for saying, hey, seller, by the way, this is how this is gonna go, and you're still protected. Was there a hand over here? Oh, it's sitting there.
If you form an LLC with 2 partners, and you, in your agreement, you say, okay, party A has 30%, party B has 70%, and you have $1 million judgment against the LLC. Is there any differentiation on who has more responsibility based on that breakdown?
Yeah, it's the assets of the liability that it goes to, right? So if someone put in 70% of the money, let's say you put $1 million in the bank as a reserve, then practically yes, But the LLC, if that's the LLC money, or the LLC owns two properties, the judgment is going against the LLC, ultimately. So it's whatever the LLC owns specifically. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so let's say you had like 30% of it was the person doing all the work, and the person who was 70% that put in the money. I guess it's all just gonna be one pot at the point where you're looking for a judgment.
Yep, exactly. It's what the LLC owns. And if someone's gotten 30% through sweat equity, you know, again, you're also presuming that they're not gonna be able to pierce the corporate veil in that situation, but let's say that it's running profitably, it's what the LLC owns, right? So if the LLC has $500,000 in the bank, it's the LLC's money. And it's actually the person who owns 70% has contributed to the LLC under these conditions to get whatever distributions, ultimately, whatever profits. But it's gonna be, the LLC's assets are what is going to be at stake. Do you have a question?
Yes, are you familiar with, when we went to Bill Knowles' thing at Trig, she talked about having an LLC with you being in a partnership with, a corporation?
Yeah.
The corporation being 1% or something like
Yeah,
that?
that's a tax structure. So he's talking about, the question is about whether when you own an LLC, is it important for tax reasons to have it as a partnership, which means that at least one other person or legal entity owns 1 to 2% of that legal entity for tax reasons. I've gotta refer you back to your CPAs on that. You do wanna make sure you talk to a good CPA, and you do wanna talk about what it means if you have an LLC, if it's just a straight pass-through, if it's taxed as a partnership. You know, you want that on your radar, because that's gonna be important for how you structure it, not necessarily for liability reasons, obviously, but for how you ultimately get taxed, so.
All right, one last question.
Yes.
So I just want to toss it out here for, let's say I have a deal, and I'm bringing in somebody who's bringing in some money. I'm just bringing the deal. What's the simplest way that you like to see that deal structured? I bring the deal, somebody brings the money.
Well, I mean, is this gonna be an ongoing thing, or is this just a buy and hold, or?
Just not an ongoing thing, just a one deal scenario, but it is a buy.
Like a flip?
Nope.
Let's do buy and hold.
Let's do buy and hold. Passive, and they're passive. They don't wanna be involved, they just wanna bring some cash.
Okay, so then you figure out, you come to an agreement as to what that money is worth, what bringing the deal is worth, and then who has what responsibility and what roles. You can put that into a simple LLC structure and say that my money's worth 70% and my sweat equity is worth 30%. My 30% means that I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and I'm gonna continue to manage it and go through the life of the property, as long as we hold it this LLC. You can do something as simply as that. You know, and then still have an annual meeting. I mean, being a passive investor, doesn't mean that you never, ever touch it per se, but like having an annual meeting over the phone and putting something right and say, hey, we met. This is what we talked about. This is how much money we made on the property this year.
Just a simple LLC structure. You guys in the operating agreement decide on the split of what that's worth, and that's it.
Yeah, that's a very simple way to do it, straightforward way to do it.
What about in a flip scenario then? Would you do it different?
Not necessarily. I mean, you need to very clearly define the roles of who's doing what the money means. I've seen litigation, got clients in litigation over that very thing, where there was an understanding of this person brought money and I was bringing the deal, I was doing X, Y, and Z, but it was never put in writing. And now we're a year and a half into a court case. So you just gotta be you wanna be very specific about the roles and who's doing what and what that means and how that plays out as far as the roles and responsibilities of the entity, so.
And one last thing on mine, and then see if Billy has a question. All right, one last thing.
Yep.
If I wanted to I'm talking with a partner about how we want to separate things out. What's my next step? We're chatting it out. We think we have an idea of how we want the deal to go. Is it show up at my attorney's door time?
Yeah, I mean, if you have a structure that you're thinking about, that you want to set up, I'm meeting with clients tomorrow to talk about that very scenario. Two people who want to start an LLC to do flips, right? So they wanna come in, I'm sitting down with them to talk about how they wanna structure it, what the rules are, who's gonna own what percentage, who's gonna put money in, is it totally 50-50 equally, is it not 50-50? I mean, just run through some typical scenarios of what they're looking to do, how they're looking to do it. Like, what happens if one of them wants out, you know, do they just shut it down, do they have these buyout provisions, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Cool.
So,
Alright.
yep. One last question for you.
So, if you're doing the same thing, I'm bringing the money from a self-directed IRA to do a flip.
Okay.
Is that something that I need protection with an LLC, or is it?
I don't think you can invest money through a self-directed IRA through an LLC. I
Okay.
believe. The self-directed IRA is gonna have to own the property itself.
Right.
Right? So LLCs and self-directed IRAs usually aren't compatible.
So, okay.
Yeah.
So, am I protected though, like, if somebody did come after it? Or
Well, the
they just come after
self-directed
whatever's in that-
self-directed IRA is,
They would just come after whatever's in the IRA, or whatever owns it, but the IRA owns it, so I guess that's all they can come
John,
after.
should the self-directed own a promissory note that
What's
is, they can protected necessarily, and you won't be backed by real estate.
yeah, I'm not 100% sure I'm tracking your question there. You're asking a liability question. If the self-directed IRA owns it, then the self-directed IRA is gonna be liable as the owner for the asset. What were you asking about?
One way to get around it, if he's doing is it a partnership, Billy, or just straight buying it?
Straight finance, just straight.
So a self-directed IRA could lend to an LLC, is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
No.
So,
Mine was for a partnership.
Oh,
To get
okay.
around that LLC.
Yeah, there are very, very specific rules about self-directed IRAs and what they can lend to, and if you have control over what they're lending to, there are a lot of prohibitions on that.
It's like self-dealing, right? Is that the?
Self-dealing is the
Yeah.
term, exactly. So, but that's a whole nother
The company
ball of
that
wax.
owns the IRA, they should be able to walk you through that.
I was
Yeah.
just wondering if anything extra was needed, as far as the LLC or whatever, that's really what my question was.
Yeah.
You basically said no, so.
Right, well, yeah, usually if you're using a self-directed IRA to buy property, you're not gonna be able to do it with an LLC, and you're gonna have to be really careful to make sure you cut very square corners for the IRS's purposes to make sure you get that done, so.
Alright, folks.
Okay.
Thanks, John.
I left a bunch of cards up here on the table, and if any of you guys wanna grab one, feel free.
I'll also send John's contact information out and just a follow-up email, but,
Thank you
anyway,
guys for being here. I hope you weren't too bored.
thanks for coming tonight, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
I read it. I know that. Hi. Lakeisha, nice to meet you.